you've got to, just like I said earlier, you've got to make contact with the awareness of awareness, right? That's a very important part of this, right? The same thing is true. You have to develop a distinction called being, right? Before you knew about the possibility of who you are, the idea of being didn't exist. You were just being a person. You know, if you talk to somebody about this, they say, what are you talking about? Being, right? No. So you have to gradually come to see what being is. And being is the experience you're having when there's no thinking, right? Now, by being aware of the experience of being when there's no thinking and getting a feeling for it, like what it's like when that's the case, right? You can begin to experience being all the time. Because it's always been going on, but you've been only aware of thinking, right? So now through meditation, you're starting to be aware of being aware, right? And you're starting to have a distinction called being, and being is different than thinking. Right? So through the process of practicing meditation, I was talking to somebody about this today, and I hope you guys understand that meditation is the beginning of a process that will eventually move out of formal meditation to informal meditation. You get that? Yeah. Eventually be something you're doing all the time, and then if you continue with it and you're doing it correctly, it disappears. In other words, it's just natural. It's just natural. That's where we want to get, is to the natural state, right? Where meditation becomes like listening to good music instead of trying to do anything. You're just enjoying the experience, that's all. You're not trying to go anywhere when you get to a place where you've practiced sufficiently enough and gotten the value out of it. Now, so what I was saying earlier, right? So when you've come here and you've listened to things and there were things that you were confused about and didn't understand. Now, over time, right, was it not the case that some of those things started to clear up and you started to see things that you didn't understand and then you did understand? Yes? Yeah. So that's how it works, right? So confusion and not understanding is just part of the process, right, of becoming clearer and clearer, you know? As a matter of fact, in Scientology, and I don't endorse Scientology, but they talk about becoming a clear. Becoming a clear is to become somebody who's enlightened according to Scientology. And what they do, and by the way, Dianetics, are you familiar with Ron L. Hubbard? Yeah. He was the founder of Scientology. And his book, Dianetics, right, actually is very powerful and very true. What happened after that with Scientology, God knows. I have no idea how they got where they went, right? But I read Dianetics long ago, and it's actually very, very useful. It's a very, very useful book. So it's one of those things, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? That particular book was revolutionary, right, in terms of talking about how people are a machine that is constantly being triggered. That's basically what Dianetics is. And in Dianetics, they're talking about a process in which you can gradually reduce the degree to which you're triggered until you're clear. That's what a clear is, somebody who's not triggered anymore, like that, right? And through this process that you've been involved with here in the practice of meditation, right, I've heard people share here that they have had the experience of not being upset where they were always upset when this particular thing happened, right? Yeah. I'll tell you, I can tell you from my own experience, and it's one of the reasons that I'm here, is that in my own life, the revolution that I experienced that went from being somebody who was just as vulnerable in terms of reactions, right, and getting triggered as anybody else, you know. And this is one of the things that really was disturbing to me as a psychologist, you know, because I'm supposed to be treating this problem, not having the problem, right? But then through the discovery of what spiritual teachings and practices offer, right, you come to understand that it is possible to begin to deconstruct and decondition yourself from that mechanical way of reacting all the time. And it's a gradual process that you begin to notice that you're less affected than you were by things that happened in the past, by things that happen now, and about concerns that you have in the future. But one of the ways that we talk about this that's a very practical thing is that all occurs in the thought process. So if we're going to be practical and we want to specifically point to exactly how do you work this, right? The way you work this is by being aware of the thought process, understanding what the thought process really is, right? The voice in your head, right? Understanding that it's not you, and then learning to monitor it so you can watch when the craziness is playing. And when the craziness is playing, you start training yourself not to express that, not to be that, right? And as you practice not expressing it and not being it, right, the compulsion to express it and be it starts to come down, right? Until the things that used to make you crazy don't upset you at all. Don't upset you at all. It's like Krishnamurti said when they said, well, how would you describe what it's like to be enlightened? And he said, oh, I just don't mind anymore.
That's good. I love that.
I don't mind what happened. Well, I'm sure by this time all of you, I hope that all of you have recognized the psychotherapeutic power of this, right? I mean, I'm a psychologist, so it would be not good for me financially to tell you that you don't need me as far as doing, psychotherapy is concerned. If I do work with people in psychotherapy, it's just to be a coach and a support person. Do you know what I mean? I'm not doing it the way most people do. Most psychologists do psychotherapy. I'm not working that way with the clients that I work with. And one of the reasons I'm not working that way is because I have experienced a revolution in my own consciousness that has made a difference, that if that can be something that other people experience, that's well worth the time and the effort, right? And it's a spiritual process. It's a spiritual process. It's always been here, and the attention and the preoccupation has been in the world, and it's been out here, right? Even from a psychological perspective, when we talk about cognition, right, and so forth, that's understood to be the person thinking, right? But you never hear a cognitive therapist talk about that thinking is generating a person, right? In conventional psychology, they don't go there, right? They just start with that you're a person and we're going to work on that. We're going to deal with that. So I don't know if I answered your question at all, but when you are not thinking, you are being, right? And that's what we're about here. And the being can occur while thinking is happening, right? But only once it's distinguished, once it's recognized, right? Then you can see that it's always here. It's always here, even when you're thinking. It's possible to be thinking, right? See, prior to making contact with the truth, prior to making contact with your true nature, right? The awareness is there, but it doesn't. It's like everything. It's like something else is there that you're not aware of, and if you're not aware of it, it doesn't exist. Right? So you're just being who you know yourself to be, right? Even though it's there, right? That's why I say the contact with it is so important, because you can't start to be what you are until you recognize it. You can't start to be who you are until you see it, until you recognize it, until it's real for you, right? It can't just be conceptual, because the conceptual understanding about it is removed from the experience, right? This is about the direct experience of it. And once the direct experience of it occurs and you have the discovery and you're aware and you know that you've had the contact, you know what awareness is, you're aware that you're aware, right? That starts a process. Right? Now the awareness is in the game, so to speak, right? And that's why one of the things that I say here is that the psychotherapeutic process that goes on through meditation and the teachings, right, is now awareness, the truth, who you really are, right? Now that's available to shine its light on what's happening. It's no longer just the person and the personality, right? You can now begin to have an awareness of the personality instead of just being the personality. You can now have an awareness of the operation of the personality in terms of how that exists in the thought process. You can be aware of thinking. That's what I was saying here earlier, that until you know that you're not the thinker, you're not aware of thinking. Until you know that you're not the thinker, you're not aware of thinking. Because when you think you're thinking, you're not seeing it objectively. It's you. See, that's the problem when you try and do psychotherapy with somebody who considers themselves to be the thinker. It's that they're very easily upset, and their ego is very easily, damaged, right? Because they identify with the thinking. That's me, right? If you question my thinking, you're questioning me. You see, there's no objectivity from it, right? And so you have to come to the understanding that you are not the thinker, so you can look at thinking like you're not you thinking, if that makes any sense. You have to be able to look at thinking like you're not you thinking. And when you look at thinking like you're not you thinking, you then can have access to it. You can have a way of looking at it that the therapist has. Right? Because if the therapist listens to you think, they're not you thinking, they're just looking at your cognition, they're just looking at your thinking. And if they play that back to you, you can start seeing how crazy you are. So one of the things that's very important to understand about this process that you're involved with, if you are involved with it yet, I think a lot of you are, right? Confusion is going to happen. And when you're confused, right, it's going to be frustrating. And it's going to be like, this doesn't make any sense. I don't understand. You know what I mean, right? And my advice to you is not, at that time, don't try and solve it. Just be present to it. Don't try and solve it. Just be aware of confusion. That's all. You don't have to, at the time. Confusion's a good thing, by the way. Most people aren't confused. That's bad. Right? They should be confused, right? They should be confused, right? But they're not. They're certain. Most people are certain, right? No, confusion's a good thing. And so you should welcome confusion. When you're confused, it means you moved out of what you thought you knew. You're aware of something else that's new to you, but you haven't integrated the two yet, you see. And so it's confusing, right, to be in that space, right? But if you stay with it, right, if you don't try and make it happen too fast and just let it work itself out, right, it will. The day will come. If you look right now, those of you who have been in the class, I just want to check with you. Maybe I'm wrong about this, right? But since you began to come to the class and since you began to hear about this possibility, right? How many of you have experienced that there were things that you heard me say or things that you were aware of and read or listened to somebody else say that made no sense to you, that you didn't understand at all what was being spoken of, but over time, as you continue...
We didn't finish the question.
Truth. And this is one of them. And so I thought tonight I would just share a little bit about it with you. It came to my attention. I was listening to Brother Paul the other day, and he quotes the Course in Miracles from time to time. Rupert Spira, he doesn't necessarily quote, he may quote the Course, I don't know, I haven't heard him quote the Course, but he has done videos where he has done a video with people who are students of the Course in Miracles and had interaction with them and compared the Course of Miracles to what he says and so forth. And other teachers have done the same thing. So that's part of the new wave of teaching, of teachers, that since this direct approach has come to pass, there's an evolutionary reality occurring in terms of how these teachings are being taught. One of the things that's different from the old days is that in the old days you had to go and have a guru and then or a master, a Zen master, somebody in that position, and then at some point they would identify people who would carry on the lineages, the people who were given permission to teach. In other words, you if you got to a certain point, the teacher would say, you're clear enough, you're enlightened enough to go ahead and teach this to other people. And that was kind of the way it went. And so whether you were a Buddhist or you were a Hindu, there was always a process, how you got certified to teach. It's not so much that way anymore. Rupert Spira had a teacher. Francis Lucille was his teacher, and then Jean Klein was Francis Lucille's teacher, and Jean Klein had a teacher, and it goes on and on and on like that, right? But it's not so much that way anymore. It's getting a lot looser in terms of you don't have to have permission from anybody to teach. So things are a lot different. Of course, Paul Hederman's an example of that too. He came up through AA, and he actually started teaching in the AA rooms, and then it went from there. But and he had been around the world. I don't know how many of you know that about Paul. Paul had been around the world. He had been to India. He had been to Thailand. He had been to Australia. He had done all these, really intensive meditation things, sweat lodges, you name it, he did it, right? He doesn't talk about it too much, but he'd been around the block a few times, so he didn't just wake up some morning and become enlightened, right? In fact, his path to enlightenment was a pretty difficult path if you listen to some of his stories about what he went through with his addictions, right? So anyway, the other day he brought up the Course in Miracles, and he read a specific passage from the Course in Miracles that I wasn't familiar with. And so I'll share that with you just to show you that this is very much the same thing. The Course in Miracles is a Christian-oriented teaching. And the way you can see the book is it's pretty, it's a pretty thick book, and it's one of those books that has these very thin pages with very small print, So this is going to be a lifetime study, right? But a lot of people love the Course in Miracles, and there's groups all over the world, study groups all over the world, and so forth. So this was channeled by a psychologist. I think she was in Columbia University. It was Columbia University?
Yeah, Jewish psychologist.
Yeah. And she wasn't particularly a spiritual person, This just started coming to her, and she was a bit freaked out about it. But eventually she followed what it was asking her to do, and it was asking her to write this stuff down, right? So she did, and another psychologist helped her, and this went on for years until the whole thing was transcribed, and it became the Course in Miracles. So, and supposedly, I'm not an expert in the Course in Miracles. I haven't read the whole thing. I've read parts of it. And supposedly this channeling was the channeling of the person of Jesus. So it's pretty, it's pretty intense. But I don't care about that. As far as I'm concerned, the truth is the truth, So what Paul shared was this passage on page 468 under the message of the holy relationship. Earlier in the book, in the Course in Miracles, there's a lot of descriptions of who you, now how does Paul say it? He says it in a very useful way. He says that it speaks to who you're not about who you are. In the beginning of the Course, it keeps describing who you're not, right? It keeps describing who you are to who you're not. It keeps describing who you are to who you're not, right? And according to Paul, and I agree with him, that's a bit of a challenge, because to talk to you about to talk to who you're not about who you are is talking to you about God, right? Talking to you about something that is non-conceptual, right? So you can see there's going to be a difficulty here, right? So people have difficulty understanding that. But then later in the Course, he says this: yet we have heard a very similar description earlier in the Course. But it was not of you. It was not of you. But still this strange idea which it does accurately describe, you think is you. You familiar with that? Does that sound familiar, who you think you are? You think is you. Reason would tell you that the world you see through eyes that are not yours must make no sense to you. To whom would seeing such as this send back its messages? Surely not you, whose sight is wholly dependent of the eyes that look upon the world. If this is not your vision, what can it show you? What can it show to you? The brain cannot interpret what your vision sees. This you would understand. The brain interprets to the body of which it is a part. But what it says you cannot understand. Yet you have listened to it, and long and hard you tried to understand its messages. So here he's talking to who you are about who you're not, okay? And it's saying that earlier in the course it was talking to who you're not about who you are. But later in the course it flips it, right? And makes a negation, right? It's talking to who you are about who you're not. That has more possibility to it because who you're not is something that we can talk about, we can become familiar with. We talk about it here a lot, about who you're not, right? The thinking process, who you think you are, the ego, all that jazz, right? So, and you can see from that paragraph, it's pretty thick, right? And so the way this course is designed, you really have to contemplate, pray, whatever, in order to interpret what it says here. And that's one of the things that is part of this process, that you're not given the truth. Even when Jesus spoke, he didn't speak straight truth, he spoke in parables, right? Recently, I was going back and looking at some earlier material that I had studied about George Gurdjieff. Have I talked about him here? George Gurdjieff? Well, so now you have another person, right? And he was a very interesting character. If you want to learn about him, there's a classic movie that's now a cult movie called Meetings with Remarkable Men, and it's about George Gurdjieff. And he was an esoteric spiritual teacher, but he wasn't somebody who was teaching Buddhism or anything like that. He was teaching a totally Western version of those kinds of the teachings. And it's a whole thing in and of itself. But you may want to check him out, because one of the things that I think is important, it certainly worked for me, is the more different teachers you study and the more different ways you hear this, right? It keeps helping you to see it for yourself, right? Keeps helping you to see it for yourself. And so I highly recommend that you look at the Course in Miracles, or, I mean, you can get this through Amazon, or look at some of George Gurdjieff's work. He wrote a book called Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, and he made up a language to write the book in, right? And he did it on purpose, right? Because he wanted to make it difficult for you to understand what he was talking about, right? So you would have to have a certain commitment to deal with it, to go through it, to learn the language, to read the book and understand the book. And he did a lot of other things. He created dances that people could do. He opened up an institute in France for developing people's psyches, spiritual lives, and so forth and so on. So I think it would be valuable to check that stuff out. So I'm not going to really go into a lot about the Course in Miracles because I really don't know a lot about it, but when Paul shared that piece, it really hit me that, later in the book that it reverses like that, right? And then the idea being, if we're talking to who you are about who you're not, as Paul shares in his own process, at some point through talking to who he is about who he's not, that allowed him to then say, well, maybe I'm not that. See, that's the whole thing. At some point, you have to be clear about the idea that you're not the body, right? You have to be clear about the idea that you're not the personality, right? So there are certain things in this process, whether you're a Buddhist or Taoist or a Gurdjieff student or whatever, there are certain things in this process that you have to go through. One of them is to make contact with your true nature. Another one is to know who you're not, to start looking at what you're not and paying attention to what you're not, and that's going to show up in thinking. That's going to show up in the thought process. That's why I've been harping recently. I mean, it says right there who you think you are, right? My mother used to say that to me every day. Who do you think you are? I didn't realize she was trying to teach me spiritual things.